שלום לכולם. אהלן. שמי גילה קורץ, אני דיקנית הפקולטה לטכנולוגיית למידה. תודה רבה אדיר על ההזמנה, על הכבוד. מקווה שאני אייצג כראוי את הפקולטה לטכנולוגיית למידה. כמו שאתם רואים, יש לי את הפעמון הזה ואני הולכת להשתמש בו. להעיר אתכם מהצהריים, אני מהדהימים שנכון הייתה ארוחה טובה, אבל זה קשה אחרי זה להתחיל להתרכז. אז הרעש הזה, אני ארוכה לעשות את הרעש הזה כל פעם שתבקשו ממני.
I'm so happy to begin the first session of the afternoon. And our first presenter is Professor Meizel. And Professor Meizel is an historian focusing on Russia and the military. He's published many articles about the Soviet and Russian army during the Russian Revolution and the World War. And he published many books in his research, the IDF. He has a book about the conquest of the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War. He's a member of, again, the Israeli Forum for Military History, an International Commission for Military History, which is one of the institutions, the research institutions under the auspices of UNESCO. Please, Professor Meizel. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Perro, for inviting me, and Professor Zuckerman. And I would like to convey my gratitude because I was able to meet many good old dear friends because of this invitation, such a wonderful group of people. I want to change my plan, and it's a shame that I didn't bring us, the slide of the Decabristic revolution, which is basically a revolution that took place in Russia in December, on the 14th of December, 1925, the day in which Nikolai I was the Tsar who gave Humboldt the permission to travel through Russia. And that day, he was supposed to receive that title or that role. There was a little revolution that took place in the central piazza of, again, St. Petersburg. And it was the last military revolution since the times of Peter the Great. And again, this was the last before the Russian Revolution. It was a traumatic event in Russian history. When Nikolai I took power, again, he was infamous in his very severe and very tough and very repressive power and rule. And people don't really know this, but Nikolai I was the first. He was sign and symbol for this. And then Humboldt dared and came and asked to, again, tour through the land of Nikolai I. And Alexander von Humboldt, for 10 or 11 years or so, tried to take that voyage in Russia before Nikolai I took power, and he knew well the whole, episode of that revolution, the Decabristic revolution, and he didn't say a word about it. And throughout his voyage through Russia, he didn't deal with it at all. He was not, again, focused on social, political problems whatsoever. And this is very ironical because that invitation to visit, or that permit that he was given, actually stemmed from the fact that he had skills, scientific skills, and they actually wanted to exploit the knowledge he had of mines for Russian industry. So from Petersburg, he left in May in 1889, and he came back in November. This was, again, a voyage of about 8 months or so. It was very long. He actually reached Siberia, and during these 8 months, he traveled some 15,000 kilometers. He, again, stopped in hundreds of places and used about 12,000 or so horses. He wrote down all these details, by the way. He wrote a diary, a very detailed diary. And he and his friends, his partners, traveled in different wagons, horse carts. and they had guidance and escort. They were escorted by Cossack units of the Russian Imperial Army at the time. And he had a whole group of servants. They were welcomed in every place. They were given everything they needed, all they desired throughout the different stops, and they were all, they had beautiful attire. So if you, again, you read Gogol's book, you can just multiply this number of times to understand, again, that glory that he came across. I'm talking about Alex von Humboldt, of course. But again, this voyage of his had a different aim. Because this huge entity, Russia, was of interest to him. He knew it was very difficult to get to Russia, and he kept on exerting efforts, for about 8, 10, 11 years. He used the Prussian family to do this. And then he came across Cancun, and if you know that Cancun, again, has a lot of non-Russian elements, but there were non-Russian ancestors to this family. And Cancun also had a role in the Science Academy in Prussia, and some of his family was of German origin. And Cancun wanted to use von Humboldt to be able to improve the financial status or industrial status of Russia. Cancun knew that Humboldt, I say Humboldt, I'm talking about Alexander von Humboldt, yes? Again, was an expert on mines, and that he had helped finding all sorts of resources like diamonds and golds and other precious steels, and that is what he wanted to do. He wanted him to do it in Russia, although the acceptable opinion was that in Russia and in Siberia there were no diamonds. And then Alex von Humboldt found diamond again. This voyage, again, was worthwhile. It was financed by the Russian crown, and of course he was rewarded, and all was well. And as I said, he traveled huge distances, about 15,000 kilometers, even more so. And this was a political step of sorts as well, because the fact that he received this invitation from Nikolai, from Tsar Nikolai, was a political statement. And to what extent he understood this, I think he did. Maybe some others did. Others understand this, I'm not sure. But the Russians understood that this was a political step or statement, because he was accepting the Tsar. And there were two populations in Russia, one that hardly heard about him, about 99% of the Russian residents, especially the farmers. And there was a very small group who knew who Humboldt was. Some of them were very educated people, also in his time. And we call it sort of the elite, the aristocracy, although this wasn't the acceptable term in Russia, but I will use it. And they also abided by Cancun, by that minister, right, of the Russian royalty, and he was again asked and commanded not to research anything political, not to write anything political, and Humboldt was loyal to this agreement, and he did not deal in it at all. And we don't see that he wrote about it at all, because in his various writings and diaries, he didn't write about politics, but he did write a lot about what he saw, about the scenery, about animal life that he saw, about plant life that he saw. And this was a fresh perspective. It was something very new, innovative, something that had not been written about in Russian research till that point. And he even dared, and I will show you in a moment in the slide, to do something that he was prohibited to do, by the way, by the Tsar. He was supposed to arrive in Humboldt. That was supposed to be his final destination, but he carried on. He actually arrived again at the border with Russia and Mongolia, which was somewhat of a state. There was such a country at the time, and even China, Mongolia and China, and even, actually crossed the border. It wasn't set in any way. It wasn't a formal border in any way. But he did meet some Tibetan and Mongolese tribes, and he wrote a lovely diary about this. And then he went back through the lower Volga until, again, the northern Caspian Sea. It was a very fascinating voyage. Again, it was done again in luxurious conditions, and he even wrote that the roads in Russia were wonderful. He compared them to roads in England. So again, yes, he fell in that trap that they had set for him. But Cotton was one of the governors in the area. Humboldt knew who Jomponkim was when Katrina trekked through the Ukraine and sailed on the river. He actually placed sort of these facades and created supposed villages that look really wonderful, but there was nothing behind that sort of facade. And here comes von Humboldt, who didn't really know what's going on in Russia, but he writes that the roads were wonderful. The roads there were hardly wonderful. Maybe there was one high road into Siberia, and that's it. So what is Russia? You see, Russia takes up most of Asia, as you can see. This map is imperial Russia. It's not today's Russia. Today's Russia is a little smaller. Alaska did not belong to Russia at this point. It was sold to the US in 1867. I didn't want to show you the different stages because that's the gist of my presentation, but this was actually the country. Till this day, by the way, today's Russia, which is much smaller than what you see here, is, in terms of its area, it's the biggest country in the world. Much more than the other countries. I would say it's almost twofold in size than the USO. It's bigger than Canada. It's bigger than Australia, than Antarctica, and whatever you will. In terms of its population, today's Russia is, again, comprised of about 144 million citizens. It's less than half of the population of the US, but it's 9th place around the world in terms of its population. So it's a huge country. Again, with a very intense history and very different from the historical patterns of the Western world. So again, if we were to divide again, the world into the Roman Greek legacy, historically speaking, Russia is different. And this Russia, it didn't start off. This wasn't the original size. It was much smaller at first. But Alexander von Humboldt was really opposed to colonialism because he knew Latin colonialism or Iberian colonialism, like Spain and Portugal. He saw what colonialism looks like again in Latin America, Southern America, Central America. He opposed these extremely. And he believed that how they damaged, the scenery, animal life, plant life, how they hurt people. He didn't write about it, but he recognized this well. He was very familiar with this destruction in all those areas. He understood the demographic role of plagues and illnesses, but again, white people from Europe brought all these plagues and diseases to native populations. He wrote about this. That is why he objected to colonialism. But he wasn't so familiar with Dutch colonialism in East Asia, but he was familiar with the history of British colonialism, which is North America. He knew Jefferson. He talked to Jefferson, this was said already, and he opposed this. However, from our perspective, and something that he did not do, we have to make a distinction between imperialism and colonialism. I think the root of imperialism, it goes back to the Roman Empire, and we will point out a few different things in European history, also during Humboldt's time. That weird political creation of the sort of that sacred Roman empire which kind of disappeared in his life, but colonialism did exist. And what is colonialism? So let me say something here that he did relate to, but he didn't write it explicitly. It's basically taking over countries and nations, remote nations and countries that don't have immediate contact to that metropolitan state for purposes of exploitation, economical exploitation first and foremost, but also political, military, and other types of exploitation. And if you want an example, I would say this is what the Spaniards did in Latin America. This is what the Dutch did in part in India, in the Indies Islands, and the islands of Eastern Asia. He talked about that destruction that it brings to the world, that it brings to the ecology. You didn't know the word ecology. But at the end of the slides, I'll show you a slide that shows you exactly how he understood that these things happened and how he perceived this. So let me just show you just the slide again. Okay, this is a physical map of Russia. And as you can see in the southern parts of this map, these are again mountainous parts that border with, again, parts of the world that boast the highest mountains. In the northern part of Russia seem to be sort of lowlands, which is true. But these are, again, places that are uninhabitable. And in a moment, we'll see another map, what it means living there, what their status is. Now, these are places that are, again, taiga and tundra. These are huge forests on swamplands. Huge rivers that flow, some but very, very shallow, but take up a huge part, and again are very swampy. One cannot pass these, one cannot inhabit these. So the main part of Siberia, again, is in the southern area where people do live. And this is where it all begins. Okay, so why did Alexander von Humboldt, he did not write about this, again, because he had an agreement with Nikolai, but he could not write about Russian colonialism. Why? Because in actual fact, I would say the actual, growth and expansion of Russia was not colonialistic in nature. It had a different character. And I would say that this process actually leads us, at the end of the day, to see how from a much smaller country where Russian history began, we arrive at that huge country, the biggest one in the world. What you can see here, again, is the surface area of Russia. This is a map of Imperial Russia. So just if you remove that brownish reddish part in that southern tip, which today are again Central Asia today, we basically have today's Russia. So in this country, there wasn't, again, this metropolitan population and a native population. That didn't happen. There wasn't a distinction like we have today in the British Empire, for example, between Scottish Brits and, on the other hand, Pakistani or Indian people, again, who's now Prime Minister today. Anyway, but in Russia there was no such thing. Another word that I want to use, that the Russians never used, by the way, but it, what did exist in other cultures, okay? The purity of the race. Never. It was always a mixed race. It was filled with all sorts of ethnic people, people of Slavic ethnicity, and Turco-Urali, Mongoli people. And what do I mean? The Slavics appear on the world stage relatively late. When the Roman historians wrote about, Germans, they write about, again, those beyond the Germanic border. They didn't know then. That's where the Slavic people resided. And Slavic countries formed in the 8th century, especially in the 9th century, and henceforth. That is when, so until that period in time, those people who arrived in Western Europe, again, were of Turkish or Mongolese or or from the Ural Mountains. And they did not stay in Europe, but they actually went back, except for the Hunis, who they called the Hungarians today. All the rest went back east. By the way, Attila is actually a Hungarian name, a very common Hungarian name. We even have a Jewish journalist, Israeli journalist called Attila. Yes. In the 9th century, we find units or political units, Slavic units, like in Poland, in Bohemia, and the Eastern units, Russia. So a Russian country was formed, the center of which was Kiev, and alongside this another Slavic Russian country. And the population is Slavic, with a mixture of all these nations that invaded from the east, Kumani Chikchaki and Pecheneginese, all sorts of nations. And they can make the distinction between themselves, but they are mixed populations. So the ruling population, even the elite later on, were Slavic. And they adopt lines, or 2 or 3 lines of Vikings, those who came through the commercial lines from the southern part of the Scandinavian islands through the Baltic Sea and the rivers southwards until the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea to Constantinople. And in this way, this country was formed. Again, the center of which was Kiev, and it was called, the big sort of an emirate, but it was different than any sorts of, those, it's called kniash, sort of around a royal house. And the heads were Slavics. They appoint a Viking ruler who had arrived. He becomes, his name is Rurik. And all sorts of, again, myths and legends were formed about, again, Kish, again, who formed Kiev with his sister, and that's why Kiev is called Kiev. I'm not going to go into detail here. But he was that big prince of Kiev, as he was known. And this Kievi sort of state was formed, north of which Norvogin state was formed, which is a sort of a republic. And at a certain point in time, from about the 10th century or so, both of these unite. And during the 10th century and then in the 11th century, a new state was formed. Again, the center was still Kiev, headed by, again, the Rurik house of royalty. Okay, he's that great prince. So this, again, great prince of Kiev. And this state, again, is formed by all these little royalties headed by kniaz, one kniaz or other. This means that this state, in order to expand and spread forth, creates sub-states within itself, and among each other, they have a lot of disputes, military disputes, they wage wars, and again, the prince of one state suddenly takes over another little state, and and so it goes, and they keep changing. And when slowly the state was formed, it forms over a long time, and in the 11th century, and we like to point out this year, 1154, okay, the son of Vladimir, the Holy Yugoslav, the Wise, takes power. And in this is the greatest territory in Europe at the time, more than any other principality or some sort of state at the time. From the Black Sea, okay, the edge of which is borders from on the Black Sea all the way to the White Sea. And it is comprised of these principalities, different principalities, that are connected one to the other, but are headed by different people. It was probably the biggest in terms of size, in terms of population, and its wealth than any other state at the time. And when the King of France, again, is able to marry off his daughter to the Prince of Kiev, that is considered to be a huge achievement. So this country, that is how it was formed. And in the 10th century already, I said, it came across the same problems that we, the Jews, came across. And if you read the Kuzari, knows this well. This is a religious problem. It's not just a religious problem. It's also a social problem. It's not only a political problem. It's an international question or problem. Again, the status of the community within the country, the ruler, what is his status within the state. And I would like to highlight once again that a great part of the residents living there and all those little units or political entities that bordered on the east were sort of Turkish nations or Mongolese in origin. And they were all intertwined and they intermarried. You know, they married the simple population, the common folk, but even the elites and the great princesses marry the Khans or the heads of those tribes, the tribes of the east. So the culture that was formed was sort of Mongol sort of culture, something between Eastern culture, Turkish, Mongolese. And one of my teachers at the time when I wrote my PhD wrote about the Ivan the Terrible, right? The Russian Tsar between Basilius and Khan. Okay, somewhere in between, meaning between sort of a Greek king and Khan, which is the Central Asian term for prince. And then they intermarry, they decide to adopt Christianity. So the religion became Christianity. So in its Byzantine sort of version of Constantinople, and the alphabet they use are the Greek alphabet, not Latin alphabet. And that is a decision. It's a political decision, it's a religious decision, it's a cultural decision, a very important one. And so Russia from that point in time is already different from Western Europe. What we know about France and about England is not true of Russian history. The generalizations are not the same. Sorry, they're asking something from the audience. The Greek alphabet, again, as it is used by Russians, is called Cyrillic writing. It's the same thing. Okay, what in Latin is C, okay? In Russian, it's S. It's like S. It sounds like a S. Or in Western countries, okay, P in Russian is like R, Resh, Hebrew Resh. Okay, these little differences. But again, this is the writing is different, right? Yeah, the shin is like in Hebrew. True. But again, the minute they come across je, then it's the end of that. All similarity ends. But again, so this was a political, religious, cultural decision, as I said, and it's always sort of juxtaposed to the Western Slavic countries that were Catholic. And that is why there was a conflict in Ukraine. And I have to, talk about Ukraine these days, right? In any case, this Russian country reaches again its golden era in the 12th century, and then the beginning of the 13th century, it's demolished the Mongolese invasions. Again, Genghis Khan, Mongolia, it was the biggest, again, empire ever. The Mongolian army invaded at a crazy pace, unprecedented in history. So the Mongolians again enter Kiev, and in a number of battles, it takes time, over dozens of years. 1242, Kiev is conquered and destroyed. And this entire structure of all those Kievian sort of states or units or political units was destroyed. Henceforth, we found ourselves again in a point of time until the middle of the 14th century or 15th century. We have a Mongolese or Mongolian empire or rule. Or the Tartars, as they were known later on, which is again they in Astrakhan, which is near again the edge of the Volga, the origin of the Volga. Sorry, that's next to the Caspian Sea, and one again resided in Crimea. And those Mongolian tribes, they also fight one with one another. And these hordes, those Mongolian sort of hordes, again, which is centered in Astrakhan, basically rules over all the Russian principalities. Now, they don't annul these. These principalities continue to exist, and the residents lived as they did before, and the population is still mainly Slavic, but always has other components of Central Asia as well. And we see it also through the names, if I may. Okay, I'm jumping to the 20th centuries. In Lenin's family, we find Tatarian origins, Jewish ones as well. And those sort of hordes rule over these principalities. The rule is manifest in that we see those militaries that were called sort of the golden hordes of the Tartars. They basically invade those Russian principalities or units, and they determined who will be that great prince of every such principality. Let's take again the prince, okay, the prince in Russian history, Alexander. His name, again, emanates from the fact that he, with his army, when he was the Princess of Novgorod, again, basically defeated the German Teutonian army. And later on, and this is very, very famous, Alexander Nevsky in 1240, what was it? 42 or maybe 43. And again, from the year that the Mongolians destroy Kiev, and he wants to be the great prince of Krias, of course, he defeats the Germanic, again, Teutonian army. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, can actually see the film Eisenstein's movie, Alexander Nevsky. And Prokofiev wrote music for this. It became the cantata, I think one of the most amazing creation in the 20th century. And also the movies is one of the greatest creations ever. And if you've seen that film, and I hope that you actually noticed this, that it was in black and white. It was in black and white, 1938 movie. Again, there was a huge dispute between, again, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. And again, the Russians, who are the goodies that win, are clothed in black, and the bad guys are in white. So we actually have this sort of reversal, meaning it's to think differently about the world. So let's just maybe go back for a moment. So the Russian, again, countries that we lived, and Kiev was very weak at the time. And Kiev is on the Dnieper, which is, again, for hundreds years later, was known to be as Ukraine. But now they had no resurrection at the time. Who did have resurrection were those Russian principalities that were more towards the northeastern areas, the more remote areas, colder areas. And there is a claim that the fact that they were able to disseminate towards that area was because of the climate that was different. I mean, the climate was manageable, inhabitable, and there were Russian principalities that formed from Kiev and northwards and eastwards all the way to the White Sea, and then spread into Asia from the east of the White Sea all the way to the Arctic Ocean. And these countries grew with time and expanded. Now, how did they grow? First of all, from trade. They could trade. There was with whom to trade. And also, the second thing is population. They were very big states. Their population, let's say, in the year 1000, Common Era, imagine their population of the Kiev Principality was about 2.25 million residents. That's huge. That's a huge number. I mean, in relation to all the other countries of Europe at the time. And we keep seeing this consistently. For example, in the year 500 CE, in this area of Russia, there were about 5 million residents. Who are these people? They are farmers. A small part of them were free farmers, also the Tatars and the Mongolians among them. Most of them are Holopian farmers. That means they actually work the land. They belong to the owner. They work the lands of the owner and the big prince. And those estate owners are the elite. They will be called buyarins later on. And that is how we see a process that is extremely interesting. Those territories that belong to the Kiev royal house or principality, again, east of Dnieper, like Galicia, Poland, okay, they border with the Baltic states. These territories were conquered by other empires, the Tatars or the Polish. I didn't even get to anything. Wow. So the Polish, as I said, and the Lithuanians. The Lithuanian Empire is from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Russians of the Kiev Principality. Okay, there was again a principality was from the Vladimir Principality, and this is Dal Principality, in which Yudel Gorokin, it means again the one of the long arm, established Moscow, which became the biggest principality of Moscow. And it keeps, fighting all sorts of other principalities, especially the Tversk Principality, which lies to the north, and then it expands eastwards more and more, and then fights again that Mongolian, the golden hordes, as I called it. So we see how the state expands, and the population is not a foreign state that is population that is conquered. It's not again like the Brits conquered the Indians. No, this is the Slavic Russian population, and it keeps growing. And we see that again throughout all this battle. I don't have much time. A new Moscow Principality was formed in the 16th century. And then in the 16th century, Constantinople falls. And there is a new approach that talks about Rome the Third. There are religious terms where they're all using secular terms. So what is Rome the Third? We had Rome, right? Original Rome. Then there was the second Rome of Constantinople. And it fell. And now this is the third Rome, Roman Empire, Moscow. So we have ideology here. We have religious aspect here. And the fact that the country was growing with its very firm agricultural foundation and its trade capabilities, and the fact that it was moving northwards and eastwards. And then who takes power? A big, again, Moscowing and Prince Ivan, who decides that he would inherit the former principalities. He's no longer a great princess. He calls himself a Tsar, a Caesar. It's completely different. And then he imposes a completely new rule in Russia of his noble group, noble circles. He starts with waging a war. I would call it a modernization of the Russian rule. You can call it such. And he basically undermines the boyard, which was the elite circle, which was under him. And he wages war both in the east and in the west. He's successful in the east. He conquers Kazan. And once again, let me take you back to Eisenstein and his movie. Okay, it's a long movie. Okay, in color, Ivan the Terrible. Stalin didn't like this film. And there in the film, he talks about the Kazan, the conquest of Kazan. What is that? It's not that the population was destroyed, not at all. The conquest of Kazan was, again, getting rid of the of the prince and assimilating the Tatarian population on the Volga into the local population. And this pattern recurs and continues until the beginning of the 20th century, because a different conquest, very broad conquest, especially in the east, and assimilating or integrating the population into Russian population. And no differences were formed. There were no legal differences or distinctions. And if there were financial distinction, it was also only because of the nature of the economy. And it wasn't done in a superficial manner. So if there are any legal differences, it was because it was imposed on the entire Russian population, also those near Moscow, except for one thing. The population of traditional Russia were, again, those farmers, those permanent farmers that I mentioned. That's the key factor. key factor of economical and political life in Russia. Those permanent farmers on those lands until the 19th century. Sorry, we couldn't hear what was asked from the audience. Yes, it's a complex picture. I don't want to, again, of course, I'm going through, 300 years just in a nutshell. Can't talk about all these details. But again, the process is completely different than colonialism. Because even when they use the word colony or colonialism, the fact that they sort of maybe built some colonies here, and that means that they basically are relocating and putting Russian farmers in different areas. And in the 19th century, these Russian farmers actually wander from Russia, that purple and the green in the picture, they wander eastwards, they move eastwards, because the minute they cross over the Urals and arrive in Siberia, they are no longer such farmers, those permanent farmers. See, we don't have that in Siberia, and we have a new population of Russian farmers. There's a wave of immigration, Russian immigration, during the 19th century, especially during the second half, from Russia eastwards. And here you can see a map that basically shows this. You can see in red, that's Russian Slavic population, and you can see how they move and expand out to the different places where in Siberia that are inhabitable. You can see those that are going towards the north, that's along the rivers, those big rivers where people can actually live. That was the aim of Humboldt. He wanted to get to the Yenisei River. I think it's the fourth in terms of length in the world. We have the Nile, the Amazon, the Yangtze, and the Yenisei, right? Fourth one. Mississippi, maybe in Missouri, right? Okay, maybe. So here you can see where the people dwell, and again, in blue, those are Central European populations, like Kazachim, and they had different names back then, and they had a whole different awareness back then. So here you can see where people inhabit the area. And again, it's none of those permanent farmers. So in 1861, many years after the death of Alexander von Humboldt, 2 years, but it's already a long time, because again, he didn't deal with, again, Russian politics and history. He didn't understand. In 55, the Tsar Nikolai died, and his son, Nikolai Nikolaevich, took over, and he redeemed the farmers, and he annulled that permanent status. There was a whole new era in Russia. And in terms, in a religious perspective, I mean, they actually saw him as a divinity. Wow, he's like a Jesus. Since that time, meaning what I'm trying to basically say to you, whether against or for Humboldt, there's no Russian colonialism. There never was. It cannot be. Where was there? In Central Asia. Those Russian conquests in Central Asia created a different picture, but that's a whole different story. What I do want to just move forward, if I may, just for a moment. Yes, I just want to show you something more. Okay, same map as before. This is where Russian is spoken. Okay, the dominance of the Russian language today. And this is the voyage of von Humboldt, 1829. I'm not going to go into that. That's the main route, the high route going through Siberia. And finally, 3 pictures of what Humboldt saw. He wanted to see these things. He wanted to see the Altai, and that's where he did arrive there. This is what he wanted to see as well. And this, when he talked about human intervention in nature, you see, this is again the Lake of Aral. It was one of the fourth in the world in terms of size in 1989. Look what is left of it today. They stopped the rivers that actually had nurtured this lake, and that's enough, by the way, to reach such a state. That suffices. Why did they stop it? Again, because in the name of, again, sophistication and progress, because to irrigate all sorts of other areas. But thank you so much to all of you. Okay.
Okay. No, طبعا. One of the things that I noted with a smile is that Humboldt needed over 12,000 horses on his journey, and in order to get the momentum to do about twice as much, he take longer distances, as you heard, but something a bit more seriously. On a serious bend, Mati and I have known since our studies in high school in Tel Aviv, September 58. And then we parted ways. Mati went to history, I did math. We didn't meet for many years. Many years later, we had another meeting in an interesting juncture. He focused on military history. I was one of the planners in the Air Force missions during the 6-Day War, and we talked about it from, I from somebody who participated in the planning, and him from the historian's point of view. So thank you, Mati. I learned that you can be an imperialist without being called that. And I want to give you this token, the book of Tolkien, Cosmos, and I'm glad to provide you this. Yes, with enormous appreciation.